Dust rolls across the square under a hard summer sun. Voices and horses and heat press in from every side. A supply wagon lurches. The brace snaps. Two big draft horses bolt straight through the crowd. Screams rise, people scatter. Again, the surge, a tall figure drives forward, no pause, no thought. Hands clamp the lead bridle. Boot heels grind into the dirt. The horse rears, hauling her off her feet. The wagon veers. An elderly woman stands frozen, cane-braced, one heartbeat from the path. The distance closes to the width of a hand. The dust came first. Before the music. Before the smell of roasted corn and boiled sugar. Before anything else that summer morning, the dust came rolling down the main street of Cedar Bend, kicked up by wagon wheels and church shoes, and the restless feet of a town that had waited all year for this one day. Founders' Day. The one day Cedar Bend pretended to be a city, instead of a scattering of buildings clinging to the edge of the territory. Ribbons on every post. A fiddle already going behind the saloon doors, though it wasn't even noon. And, underneath all of it, that electric hum only a small town gets, once a year, when it finally decides to look at itself the way it wishes the rest of the world would. Josephine Larkin stood behind her table at the far end of the market row. Bolts of fabric stacked at her elbow, ribbon spools lined up like soldiers, the way she always set them, because order mattered. Because a crooked table told people you didn't take your own work seriously, and she took her work seriously. It was the only thing in this world that had never once let her down. She was 26 years old, and she was the tallest person in Cedar Bend. Man or woman, didn't matter. A full head above most of the men who tipped their hats to her, half of them not even meaning it, just performing the motion because their mothers had raised them to. She'd learned to read the difference. The real tip and the polite flinch. The flinch came when a man realized mid-motion that he'd have to look up, just slightly. Just enough to remind him of something he didn't like being reminded of. She was used to it. That didn't mean it didn't cost her something. Every single time. Because you can get used to a thing and still feel it. That was something nobody told you when you were young. They told you it gets easier. They didn't tell you easier. And painless were two very different words. She adjusted a bolt of blue calico. Straightened it again, though it hadn't needed straightening the first time. Across the street, the town was doing what it always did on Founders' Day. Watching Garrett Vance, she knew this without looking. You didn't have to look at Cedar Bend to know where its eyes were pointed. You just had to listen to the quality of the silence that followed him. The way conversations paused half a beat too long. The way 3 different women had worn their good dresses to a corn festival. God help them. Pearl buttons and all, standing near the lemonade stand since 9 in the morning like they were guarding it. Josephine didn't care where Garrett Vance walked. She told herself that. Flatly. The way you tell yourself something you need to be true. She should thread to sell. Ribbon to sell. A dress order for Adelaide Kessler that needed finishing by Thursday. That was her Founders' Day. Numbers and stitches and the small, steady satisfaction of a table that stayed straight no matter how crooked the rest of the world insisted on being, which was when the shadow fell across her table. Not Garrett Vance's shadow. Worse. Beatrice Colby's. Miss Larkin. Beatrice said the name the way some women said the names of diseases. Careful. Distant. A little disgusted with having to say it at all. She was dressed in deep rust silk, the kind that cost more than Josephine made in 2 good months, and she carried a folded green dress over one arm like it was evidence in a trial, which in a way it was. Mrs. Colby. Josephine kept her hands moving, folding, not looking up right away, because looking up too fast gave people the idea you were eager for their attention, and she was not eager, not for this woman's attention. The hem. Beatrice held the dress up, shook it once, sharp so the fabric snapped like a small whip. Came loose after one wearing one. I reinforced that hem 3 times before delivery. Josephine set the muslin down, met her eyes now. Steady. I'd be glad to repair it again. No charge. I'm not interested in a repair, Miss Larkin. I'm interested in what I paid for, which was not this. A crowd was forming, not obviously. Nobody was rude enough to stop and stare outright. But bodies slowed. Conversations thinned. 2 women near the ribbon cart went quiet in that specific way that meant they were listening harder than they'd ever admit to. You paid for the work as agreed, Josephine said. I stand behind that work. I don't stand behind returning payment for something completed to the terms we set. Beatrice's mouth did something small and tight. Do you understand who you're speaking to? Yes, ma'am. I do. Because that was the trap, wasn't it? That question. Do you understand who you're speaking to? As if the answer was supposed to be a door swinging open. As if being reminded of Beatrice Colby's name was supposed to make Josephine forget the actual math sitting in front of her. It didn't. I imagine several women in this town would love my business, Beatrice said, voice climbing just enough to carry. Women who would be grateful, women who understand their position. Then you're welcome to take your business to them, Josephine said. Even, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than if she'd shouted. The silence that followed had weight to it. Real weight. The kind you could feel pressing against your collarbone. Beatrice's face went through 3 colors in under 2 seconds. And then, because women like Beatrice Colby did not lose in public, they simply changed the terms of losing. She reached into her small beaded purse, pulled out a fistful of coins, didn't hand them over, dropped them onto the table, half of them bouncing, skidding, 3 or 4 rolling straight off the edge and down into the churned mud of the street below. That's half, Beatrice said, for half the quality I received. Be grateful for that much. She turned, rust silk snapping around her ankles, walked off without a backward glance, the way people walk when they've decided the conversation is over, regardless of whether it actually is. Josephine stood there. For 1 second. 2. Her jaw did something small and controlled. Her eyes went bright, but they did not spill. They had learned not to spill years ago, in a different town, over a different kind of loss, and they had kept that lesson close ever since. She looked at the coins on the table. Then she looked at the mud. And then, because this was who she was, because this was who 6 years of surviving on her own 2 hands had made her, she walked around the table, bent down, into the churned, boot-print mud of Founder's Day, in front of half the market row, and picked up every single coin with her bare hands. One by one, wiped each one clean against her apron, set it on the table with the others. Counted the whole sum, careful, precise, like it was any other transaction, not the smallest, meanest humiliation a person could design. She wrapped the coins in a scrap of cloth, tucked them into her apron pocket, and when she straightened it back up a full head taller than nearly everyone still pretending not to watch, she looked directly across the street, straight into the eyes of a man she had never met. Garrett Vance had not meant to be watching. That was what he would tell himself later, and it would be, mostly a lie. He was 28 years old, and he had come to Founder's Day the way he came to every Founder's Day, because not coming had been its own kind of statement, and he was tired of the town reading statements into everything he did or didn't do. He'd tipped his hat to 6 women before 10 o'clock, eaten 2 slices of pie he hadn't wanted, said the word fine so many times in answer to so many questions about the herd, the grass, the coming winter, that the word had stopped meaning anything at all. He was tall, taller than most men in the territory, which had never mattered to him one way or another, until this exact moment, standing across a dusty street, watching a woman rise up out of the mud with her spine dead straight and her chin level and her eyes doing something that had nothing to do with tears and everything to do with refusal. He had never, not once in 28 years, had to look up to meet someone's eyes. He was looking up now. Not far, an inch, maybe less. But it wasn't the distance that stopped the breath in his chest. It was the fact that she wasn't looking away. Every woman in Cedar Bend who'd caught his eye that morning had done the same practiced thing, held his gaze half a second, then dropped it, coy, calculated, waiting to be chased. Josephine Larkin looked straight through him like he was a fence post that happened to be standing in her line of sight. No calculation, no performance, which was somehow the single most interesting thing that had happened to him all year. He didn't move toward her. Not yet. He stood there instead, hat in his hand, though he hadn't consciously taken it off, and he watched her turn back to her table and start refolding a bolt of fabric with sharp, efficient movements. 20 things to do, and he'd just become an interruption she hadn't asked for. Something turned over in his chest. Not attraction. Not exactly. Not yet. Recognition. Closer to the word. 2 people who had each, in their own way, learned to do hard things without asking anyone to clap for them. He asked about her before lunch. Jonas Pratt ran the hardware store on the corner of Main and 2nd, and Jonas Pratt knew everything worth knowing in Cedar Bend, and a fair amount that wasn't worth knowing at all. And he had the gift men like him always developed, the gift of a man who spent his days behind a counter. Listening. Larkin, Jonas said, leaning on that counter now, delighted to have something interesting to discuss on a slow festival afternoon. Josephine Larkin, seamstress, been here 6 years now, near enough. Came the same year as that hard winter, if you recall it. Where's she from? Miller County originally, farming family. Jonas's face did the thing faces do when a story is about to turn sad and the teller knows it. Bad business over there, land dispute, contract trouble, family lost the whole place. Garrett went still, because he knew that shape of sentence. He'd grown up hearing a version of it. His own father, at the supper table, more times than Garrett could count. Remember Silas Crane, boy. Remember what a bad contract cost a man who doesn't read every line. Crane, Garrett said. Not a question. Jonas blinked. How'd you know that? Lucky guess. It wasn't luck. It was a name that had sat in his chest since childhood, since before he understood what land fraud even meant, planted there by a father who used it as a lesson, the way other men used scripture. Her father signed something he didn't understand. Jonas went on, warming to it now. Crane had a judge in his pocket over there. Whole family lost everything. Father passed not long after. Mother followed within the year. Brother went north for railroad work. And Josephine, Jonas shook his head, half admiring, half something less kind, showed up here with a sewing kit and about $14 to her name. Built that shop up from nothing. Good at the work. Better than good, honestly. Sounds like a woman worth respecting. Sounds like it, Jonas agreed, except folks around here don't always see it that way. Got a proud streak on her. Doesn't take charity. Doesn't bend for anybody. And he lowered his voice, like he was passing along something delicate. She's a big woman, Mr. Vance. Waltz, bigger than most men. Some folks find that unsettling. You know how towns talk. Garrett's jaw tightened, just slightly. Enough that Jonas noticed and decided, wisely, to change the subject to horseshoe nails. Garrett paid for nails he didn't need and walked out into the noise of Founder's Day, carrying something heavier than a paper sack. Because the name Silas Crane didn't belong only to Josephine Larkin's story. It belonged to his father's, too. He remembered it the way a boy remembers things he wasn't meant to fully understand at the time. He'd have been 9, maybe 10, a visitor at the ranch house. A cold conversation on the porch, doors shut, voices low but sharp enough to carry through the walls. His father's face after. Gray in a way Garrett had never seen before or since. Don't sign what you don't understand, boy. That man will smile at you with a knife behind his back and call it a handshake. He'd assumed all these years that his father had simply refused Crane's proposition that day, and that had been the end of it. A cautionary tale, told once and put away. A closed door. Except now there was a woman across town whose entire life had been dismantled by that same name, and Garrett found himself standing in the middle of Founder's Day with an uncomfortable question rising in his chest. What if it hadn't stayed a closed door? What if Crane, being the kind of man he was, had simply waited? Tried again later, when the boy who'd overheard that porch conversation was old enough not to be listening at doors anymore. He needed to ask someone who would have been there the whole 18 years his father had run this ranch, and the 2 since. He needed Amos. Amos Tate had run the Vance Ranch since before Garrett was old enough to sit a horse without being tied to the saddle. Weathered, silent by nature, the kind of man who said 10 words when most men said 50, and made every single one of them count. 20 years given to this outfit, all told 18 for Garrett's father, 2 more for Garrett himself, since the old man passed. Garrett found him near the corral fence that evening, checking a gate latch that didn't need checking, the way men do when they want their hands busy, while their minds work through something else. Amos, Mr. Vance. You remember a man named Silas Crane. Came around when I was a boy. My father dealt with him once. Amos's hand stopped on the latch, just for a second. Just long enough that Garrett, who had spent 2 years learning to read this man's silences the way other men read newspapers, caught it clean. Can't say the name rings much of a bell, Amos said. Which was, Garrett understood immediately, a lie, a careful one. The kind a man tells when he's had years of practice deciding what's safe to remember out loud and what isn't, Amos. Long day, Mr. Vance. Amos straightened up. Wouldn't quite meet his eyes. I ought to get back to the horses. He walked off toward the barn at a pace just a shade too fast for a man who claimed to be tired. Garrett stood at the fence a long moment, watching him go. He deuced the nails in his pocket forgotten, the noise of Founder's Day drifting faint and golden from 3 streets over. Something had happened between his father and Silas Crane, something Amos Tate knew. and had decided, for reasons of his own, to bury. And somewhere across town, a woman named Josephine Larkin was folding fabric with hands that had once had a whole life pulled out from under them by that same man's name. Garrett didn't believe in coincidence. Not this particular kind. Not two threads this thick, crossing this close together by accident. She saw him again on Monday. Not across a crowded street this time. In her own shop, the bell above the door announcing him, before she'd even looked up from the collar seam she was working. Mr. Vance, Miss Larkin. He held up a work shirt, torn sleeve seam honest, wear the kind of tear that happened from actual labor and not decoration. Heard you do repairs. There are 3 other seamstresses in Cedar Bend. I'm aware the Bell sisters do fine work, faster than me most weeks. I don't need faster. He set the shirt on the counter. I need good. She looked at him for a long moment, longer than politeness required, long enough that a lesser man might have looked away first. He didn't. She came around the table, took the shirt, examined the tear with the same clinical attention she gave every piece of fabric that came through her door, turning it in the light, pressing the frayed edges together, assessing. It'll hold, she said. 2 hours work. 25 cents. That's fair. I don't discount it, I don't inflate. I respect that. She carried the shirt to her workbench. Thursday, she said, without turning around. It'll be ready Thursday. He didn't move toward the door. She stopped. Turned. Something else? I saw what happened. He Saturday, at the market. Her spine bun went a frac straighter. Not defensive. He braced. Then you saw me handle it. I saw you pick coins up out of the mud in front of half the town. And I've been thinking about it since. Something flickered across her face, not softening. Not quite, but a small recalculation, like a woman checking a figure she'd already added up once. Most people who saw that found it entertaining, Mr. Vance. A story to carry home. I'd rather you didn't dress it up as something else. I'm not dressing it up as anything. Then what are you doing? He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, the way he did most things. Unhurried, unwilling to hand her an answer that wasn't true, just because it would sound better. I don't rightly know, he admitted. I saw something Saturday I haven't been able to stop turning over, and I've learned that when that happens, it's usually worth paying attention to. Josephine stared at him. She had built 6 years of her life on a simple, reliable rule. Men with names like Vance did not develop sudden interest in women like her without wanting something behind it. Land status. A story to tell at supper about the rich man's charity. She had watched that rule prove true so many times it had stopped feeling like a rule and started feeling like weather. Something you simply planned around. I'll have your shirt Thursday, she said. He put his hat back on. Thursday. He left. She stood in the middle of her shop for a long moment. After the bell stopped ringing, both hands flat on the fabric in front of her, looking at nothing at all. He came back Thursday, and the following Tuesday, and the Thursday after that. Never empty-handed. Always some small honest repair, a sleeve, a collar, a jacket lining, pulled loose at the seam, the kind of thing that gave both of them the plain architecture of a transaction. Something to point to. Something that let them sit in the same room without either of them having to name what the room served to feel like. She noticed he always knocked, not because the shop required it, the bell did that work, but because he chose to every single time, a small courtesy performed for an audience of exactly no one. Men who were good in front of a crowd were common enough in Cedar Bend. A man who was good when nobody was there to see it was, in 6 years of careful accounting, considerably rarer. He sat in the chair by the window while she worked. Talked to her the way she'd watched men talk to other men directly, without the softened performance, most of them reserved for women. They were trying to charm or manage. He told her about the hard winter 2 years back, when 2 of his best hands left for railroad work, and he'd had to renegotiate his spring cattle contracts, alone at 26 years old, with his father 8 months in the ground. He told her, without dressing it up, about the shape of grief that came with losing a father you'd loved and been furious at in equal measure. Not the polite public grief people expected from a rancher's son, the complicated kind. The kind that included anger sitting right alongside the sorrow, uninvited and unashamed. One Tuesday in early August, he arrived to find her arguing with a delivery man over a bolt of fabric that had come in creased and water-stained at one edge, refusing to pay full price until he agreed to a fair reduction. Josephine won. She always seemed to win these particular arguments, not through volume but through simple, immovable arithmetic. the kind that left the other party feeling foolish for having tried it all. Garrett watched the whole exchange from the doorway, hat still on, waiting his turn. "You could have let that go," he said, once the delivery man had left. Muttering, cart rattling off down the street. One bolt of damaged fabric. Small enough loss. "I could have," she back to her workbench. "I don't let small losses go, Mr. Vance. Small losses are how a person ends up with nothing at all. I learned that the hard way, and I don't intend to relearn it twice." He considered that. Turned his hat once in his hands. "You ever think about doing more than mending shirts and selling ribbon?" he asked. "With a mind like that." Something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or the wariness of a woman unused to being asked what she wanted rather than what she'd learned to settle for. "What did you have in mind?" "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "Only that watching you argue a delivery man down to a fair price in under 2 minutes. I find myself thinking you could run considerably more than one counter, if anyone ever gave you the room to try." She didn't answer right away. Set down the bolt of fabric. Looked at him with the stillness she wore when a thought landed, somewhere she hadn't expected. "There are women in this town," she said finally, careful, like she was testing the weight of the idea before she committed to saying it out loud, "who do work every bit as fine as mine. Better, some of them. And they take in piecework for half what it's worth, because nobody's ever shown them a fairer way to sell it. A widow taking in laundry because laundry's the only door left open to her. A girl with a gift for embroidery and no earthly notion how to charge for it properly. Sounds like the start of something. Sounds like a fantasy," Josephine said, but something in her voice didn't quite believe that. Not entirely, and Garrett heard the gap between what she'd said and what she meant clear as a bell. "Most things worth building sound like a fantasy right up until somebody builds them," he said. She looked at him a long moment. "You say that like it's simple." "I didn't say simple, I said worth building." He set his hat on the counter, unhurried, the way he did most things. "I've watched you do harder arithmetic than this in your head, while arguing a delivery man out of $2. I don't imagine a workroom full of seamstresses would trouble you much, once you set your mind to the shape of it." Josephine didn't answer. But later that night, alone in her narrow room above Nell's boarding house, she found herself sketching out numbers she hadn't let herself sketch out in years, costs and shared costs, and what fair pay might look like for 6 women instead of 1, the pencil moving faster than she'd expected it to, like something in her had simply been waiting for permission to start. She didn't show the sketch to anyone. Not yet. Folded it small, the way she folded most things that mattered too much to risk losing, and tucked it into the same sewing box where she kept her father's old contract. 2 things now sitting together in that small wooden box. One a wound, one maybe the beginning of something that might someday sit beside it and not feel entirely like an accident. She found herself talking back. Not right away, not easily, but slowly, the way a door swollen shut in its frame gives under steady pressure, not forced. Never forced, just returned to, again and again, until it finally moves. She told him about Miller County. Not the short version she gave people who wanted the conversation over quickly. The real one. The contract her father had signed in good faith. The clause buried 3 pages deep that he never fully understood. The merchant who'd brought a judge to what was supposed to be her family's chance to fight back. She told him about her mother's face in the weeks after. The way grief and humiliation combined to make a woman disappear from the inside out long before her body follows. Garrett listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't offer solutions. Didn't say "I'm so sorry" in that reflexive way people used when they wanted credit for sympathy without actually sitting inside it. When she finished, he was quiet a moment. Then he said, "The merchant's name." Silas Crane. Something moved behind his eyes, fast, controlled, but she caught it. "I know that name," he said. Her whole body went still. "How?" "My father dealt with him once. Years back, when I was a boy. I don't know the whole of it. I intend to find out." "Why?" "Because I don't believe it's finished," Garrett said, "and I don't believe it's a coincidence that his name is sitting in both our histories." The shop went very quiet. That night, Josephine lay awake longer than usual. The ceiling was the same ceiling it always was. The boarding house sounds outside her window were the same sounds: a wagon somewhere, a dog, the low murmur of the saloon 3 streets over. Nothing had changed, except everything had, because she kept turning his words over. Not a coincidence. She kept seeing the stillness that had crossed his face at the sound of a name she'd spent 6 years trying to bury. She told herself it didn't mean anything. Told herself Silas Crane was a common enough kind of man, the kind who left aching, ruined families behind him across half the territory, and it was no great mystery that his name would cross paths with a rancher's fortune sooner or later. Except she didn't believe that, not really, because Garrett Vance did not look like a man who said, "I intend to find out," and then simply let a thing go. She fell asleep with that thought still turning, slow and unresolved, like a wheel that hadn't finished its rotation. Nell Osborne ran the boarding house where Josephine had rented her narrow room for going on 6 years now, and Nell had opinions about everything, and she had never once in that entire time managed to keep the largest of them to herself. "Garrett Vance has been asking after you," Nell said, one evening, appearing in the doorway of the shop's back room with the flush of a woman delivering important news. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I heard you, Nell. You don't seem appropriately alarmed." "Why would I be alarmed?" "Because men like that don't." Nell stopped.
"Try it again, gentler. I only mean it's unusual."
"He's not typically." She stopped again. "Interested in women like me." Josephine finished for her. Flat. Not bitter. Just a fact laid down on the table between them. The way she laid down most facts. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Nell pressed her lips together. "What if you're wrong about him?" "I'm not." "How do you know?" Josephine set down her needle, looked at her friend with the steadiness that had gotten her through 6 years of exactly this conversation, in exactly this shape, from exactly this town. "Nell, I appreciate you looking out for me. I do. But whatever his reasons are, I can tell you right now, a man with that much land doesn't develop curiosity about a seamstress 2 heads taller than his mother's parlor guests out of the goodness of his heart. Either he wants something, or he's amusing himself before the real business of his life begins. I've watched both versions happen to enough women in this territory to know the shape of the story before it finishes telling itself. What if this time it's different?" "It's never different," Josephine said, and went back to her stitching. She was being unfair. She knew it. Even as she said it, knew that she painted with a brush too wide, assigned guilt to a man who hadn't yet earned it. Let 6 years of accumulated wreckage speak louder than 3 weeks of a man showing up, on time, with his hat in his hand, listening like her words actually mattered. But loneliness, Josephine had decided a long time ago, was something she could control, and control was the only kind of safety she had ever been able to afford. The gossip found its shape quickly, the way it always did in a town the size of Cedar Bend. At first it was curious, amused even. Garrett Vance and the seamstress, the rich rancher, and the seamstress. Every version of the sentence carried the same faint mockery, the same assumption that whatever this was, it wasn't going to last past the season. Then it turned sharper. Beatrice Colby, still smarting from the market day humiliation nobody in Cedar Bend had quite let her forget, made sure the sharper version traveled fastest. She didn't need to say much. A raised eyebrow here, a pointed silence there, a comment to the right 2 women at the right moment. "I do wonder what a man like that could design to be repeated, and repeated, each retelling sanding the edges, a little crueler." Josephine heard versions of it everywhere, in the dry goods store, behind her at church, twice, appallingly, from customers standing directly at her own counter, discussing her like she was a piece of furniture that happened to have ears. She said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that giving people the reaction they were fishing for only fed the story faster. But it cost her something, every time. A small private tax she paid in the quiet hour after the shop closed, sitting alone with her hands finally still, feeling the ache of being discussed instead of spoken to. Garrett found out about the worst of it from Jonas Pratt, who delivered gossip the way other men delivered the mail reliably, and without much concern for what it cost the recipient. "Folks are saying some ugly things, Mr. Vance," Jonas said, not unkindly, just factually, the way he said most things. "About the seamstress, about why a man like you'd bother." Garrett's jaw tightened. "What kind of ugly things? The kind you'd expect?" "Her size, hey, her family." Jonas hesitated, which, for Jonas Pratt, was practically an act of restraint. "Some of it's cruel, Mr. Vance. Real cruel. Mrs. Colby's been particularly—" "I don't need the details." "No. Suppose you don't." Jonas studied him a moment. "You going to keep going round there? Now that folks are talking?" Garrett looked at him steadily. "I was already going round there before folks were talking," he said. "I don't see why their noise should change what I do next." He walked out of the hardware store with his jaw still set, and something new sitting in his chest, not quite anger, not quite protectiveness, closer to resolve. A man realizing that staying cautious, staying the kind of careful Cedar Bend expected of him, would cost more than it protected. He didn't tell her about the gossip directly. He didn't need to. She already knew, the way she knew most things about herself, that this town chose to whisper. But he changed something. Small at first. He stopped timing his visits for the quieter hours, started walking straight up Main Street to reach her shop instead of cutting through the alley the way a more careful man might have. Sat in the window chair in full view of the street, in full daylight, and let anyone who cared to look. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. It was the only survival skill she'd ever fully trusted. "You could make this easier on yourself," she said one Tuesday, not looking up from the seam in her lap. "Come round the back, I could." "You don't." "No." "Why not?" He was quiet a moment, turned his hat once in his hands, the small habit she'd catalogued weeks ago without meaning to. "Because the back door would mean I thought there was something to hide," he said. "And I don't." Josephine's needle stopped. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The shop was quiet except for the ordinary sounds of a small town going about its Tuesday, a wagon somewhere, a door closing, the distant clang of Jonas Pratt's hardware store bell. "You're either very brave," she said finally, "or you don't yet understand what this town is capable of." "Maybe both. That's not comforting, Mr. Vance." "Wasn't trying to comfort you," he said. "Was trying to tell you the truth. Figured you'd rather have that than the comfortable version." She looked up at him then. Really looked. And something loosened in her chest, faint but unmistakable, like a knot pulled tight for 6 years feeling, for just a moment, 1 degree less tight. She didn't trust it. She filed it away instead, the way she filed most things that felt dangerous, carefully, for later. To be examined again once she was certain it was safe to examine at all. It was on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into his visits, that Josephine had reason to travel out past the edge of town, a delivery. A bolt of fine wool ordered special for a rancher's wife 2 properties over, the kind of errand that took the better part of an afternoon by wagon. She didn't think much of the trip. It was work. Work was the one thing in her life that never asked more of her than she could give. The wool delivered. Payment collected and counted twice out of habit. She took the long road back towards Cedar Bend, rather than the short one, a small indulgence, the kind she rarely allowed herself, wanting an extra half hour of quiet before the shop's evening rush of customers picking up their Founder's Day orders. The long road passed within sight of the old Kessler boundary line. And past that, a stretch of land Josephine had heard mentioned only in passing, flat, well-watered ground near the river bend that had changed hands twice in the last 2 years. According to gossip, she'd only half listened to at the time. There was a sign posted at the property's edge. Fresh paint. New wood. She almost didn't stop, almost kept the wagon moving, eyes forward, mind already back in her shop, counting thread and measuring hems. Except something about the lettering caught at her, the way a snagged thread catches at a fingernail, before you even understand why you've stopped moving. Larchmont Holdings and Land Company. She didn't recognize the name, which was, in itself, strange enough to make her pull the wagon to a full stop, because she had made it her business quietly, carefully, in the 6 years since Miller County to know the name of every land company operating anywhere near her. Not out of paranoia, out of the vigilance of a woman who had watched a family lose everything to a signature nobody had read closely enough. She knew the honest companies, she knew the careful ones, and she knew, by name, every disguise Silas Crane had ever operated under in the counties she'd tracked him through, in the years after her father died, a habit she'd never told a single soul about. Not even Nell, because saying it out loud made it feel like something closer to obsession than caution. Larchmont Holdings wasn't a name she recognized, but the surveyor's mark stamped in the corner of the sign was. She had seen that exact mark before, once, on a document she still kept folded small at the bottom of her sewing box. A document with her father's signature on it, and a clause buried 3 pages deep that he had never understood, and a surveyor's stamp in the corner that belonged to a man who had, 6 years ago, worked for Silas Crane. Josephine sat very still on the wagon seat, the reins slack in her hands, the horse shifting impatiently beneath her, the whole golden ordinary afternoon suddenly gone very cold around the edges. Because if that mark meant what she thought it meant, if Larchmont Holdings was what she was very coldly certain it was, Then Silas Crane was not a closed chapter of her past, sitting safely behind her in Miller County, 6 years and 140 miles away. He was here, in Cedar Bend, buying land less than a day's ride from her own front door, under a name nobody in town had thought to question, doing to some other family exactly what he had done to hers. She sat with that thought a long moment, the horse growing more impatient, the light going gold, and then amber as the afternoon slid toward evening. Then she picked up the reins, turned the wagon back toward town, because there was only one man in Cedar Bend who had already told her, in plain words, that he didn't believe Crane's business with the Vance family was finished, and she needed very badly to know exactly what he'd already found. She found him at the edge of his own ranch, near the corral fence, in conversation with a weathered older man Josephine recognized by description before she ever heard his name spoken, Amos Tate. And the moment she came close enough to see his face, really see it, the way she saw fabric, the way she saw a hem that had been rushed or a seam sewn under duress, she understood, with the same cold certainty that had settled over her at that roadside sign, that Amos Tate already knew something he had been carrying, carefully, silently, for a very long time. He saw her coming, and for just a fraction of a second, before he arranged his face into something neutral, Josephine caught the exact flicker of unease that Garrett had caught 3 weeks earlier and hadn't yet understood the full shape of. Miss Larkin. Garrett came toward her, reading something in her face immediately. A woman, holding something too large to say lightly. What's happened? Josephine looked past him once, at Amos Tate, who had gone very quiet, very still, his hands frozen on the fence latch he'd been pretending to check. Then she looked back at Garrett. I think, she said, you and I need to talk. Somewhere private. Because whatever Amos Tate knew, whatever quiet, careful silence he had been keeping for however many years, it was about to become impossible to keep any longer. They walked to the barn. Because a corral fence in open daylight was no place for what needed saying, and Garrett understood that the second Josephine's eyes cut sideways toward Amos and did not move away, Amos went first, slow, like a man walking toward something he'd been outrunning for years and had finally run out of road. The barn smelled of hay and leather, and the dust that settles into wood that stood a long time. Garrett shut the door behind them. Not locked, just closed. Enough to say, whatever this is, it stays between the three of us until we decide otherwise, Amos. Garrett's voice was quiet, quieter than Josephine had heard it. Larchmont Holdings. Tell me you don't know that name. Amos didn't answer right away, which was, in itself, an Amos. I know it. The old man's voice came out low, rough, like something dragged up from a well that hadn't been touched in years. God help me, I know it. Josephine's chest went tight, because there it was. The thing she'd suspected on the road, cold and certain, now standing in front of her with a face and a voice and 20 years of loyalty behind it. Then you knew, she said. About my flinched. Actually flinched. A big man, weathered, the kind who'd broken horses and buried cattle and never once, in Garrett's whole memory of him, shown much of anything on his face at all. I need you to say it plain, Josephine said, please. Because please was not a word she used easily. She hated how Flint sounded in her own mouth. But some things were too large to demand, some things you had to ask for, even when every instinct told you to stand your ground and require it instead. Amos looked at Garrett first. Not her. Him. Your father had 2 dealings with Crane, not 1, he said. First one, you were too young to recall clear. That's the one he turned into supper table gospel afterward. Don't sign what you don't understand, and all the rest of it. But Crane came back around a second time, years later, wanted to try him again, dressed the same old offer up in new paper, thinking maybe your father's memory had softened. He swallowed. It hadn't. Your father turned him down flat, faster than the first time, didn't need any lawyer to tell him twice. But before he showed Crane the door, the man laid his whole operation out across that desk, showing off, I expect, wanting your father to understand exactly how much he was turning down. 6 deals. Contracts strung across 3 counties, all of them built the same way, a clause buried where nobody'd think to look, dressed up nice, signed before the man on the other side understood what he'd agreed to. My father refused, Garrett said. Not quite a question. He refused, Amos agreed both times. Second time I was there. Grown man by then, not a boy, delivering papers back and forth, same as I'd done 100 times before. I didn't think it my place to ask what I was looking at. spread out across that desk. But your name was on one of those papers, Miss Larkin. He looked at her directly now. Larkin. I recognized it the day you came to Cedar Bend, though it took me a good while to place exactly where I'd seen it before. When? Josephine said. Her voice had gone very careful. When was this second time? 6 years back, Amos said. Near enough. The spring before your father's trouble broke. Best I can reckon it now. The barn had gone very still. And you said nothing, Josephine said. I said nothing. 3 years now since you came to town, and I put the name together. Amos's voice had gone almost to a whisper. 3 years I've watched you build that shop up out of nothing, and every single time your name came up, I felt it sitting into my chest like a stone. And I told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself it wouldn't change anything even if I spoke. You were protecting the Vance name, Garrett said flat, not accusing. Just naming the shape of it out loud, the way a man names a wound before he decides how bad it is. I was protecting my job, Amos said. Raw now. Honest in a way that clearly cost him. 20 years I've given this ranch. I didn't know what speaking up would do to it. To your father's memory. To yours. I told myself silence was the safer road. He looked at Josephine directly then, and something in his weathered face broke open. Plain and unguarded, it wasn't the safer road, it was just the easier one. I'm sorry, Miss Larkin. I am so sorry. It's not worth much. I know that. But it's true. Josephine stood there, because grief didn't arrive the way you expected. She had braced for anger, prepared herself for it, even on the ride over, her hands tight on the reins the whole way. But what actually rose up in her chest was quieter, sadder, a tired, bottomless kind of recognition, because she understood fear. She understood exactly what it cost a person to choose silence over risk. She had made that same choice 100 times herself, in 100 smaller ways. Every time she smiled instead of answering back, every time she swallowed a cutting reply, because the cost of speaking felt too steep. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter, she said finally, because it does. My father spent the last months of his life believing he'd failed us through carelessness. A different truth might have changed something for him, might not have. I don't know, nobody gets to know that now. No, Amos agreed, nobody does. But I know what fear costs, as a person, Josephine went on. I know what it is, to stand in the gap between what you understand is right and what you actually do. I'm not going to pretend I've never stood in that same gap myself. She drew a breath, steadied it. What I need from you now, Amos Tate, is not an apology. It's help. Whatever you remember, every document you saw on that desk, every name, I need it all. Amos looked at her a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Firm. Whatever I remember, he said, it's yours. Josephine did not sleep that night either. She lay in her narrow room at Nell's boarding house, with her eyes open in the dark, running the whole conversation back through her mind like thread through a needle, over and over, checking each stitch, looking for where it might have gone crooked, because there was a version of this where she let it stop with Amos's confession, a version where she thanked him, forgave him in whatever measure she could manage, and let the past stay past. Except that version wasn't available to her. Not once she understood that Silas Crane wasn't a closed chapter sitting safely behind her. In Miller County. He was here now. Under a new name, on new land, likely doing to some other family exactly what he'd done to hers. And if there was one single lesson Josephine Larkin had learned in 26 years of a life that kept insisting on teaching it to her the hard way, it was this: a man like Crane did not stop. He simply moved. And somewhere down the line of his moving, there was always another family standing in the exact spot hers had once stood, with no earthly idea what was coming for them. She would not let that happen twice. Not while she had breath and a pair of hands still capable of doing something about it. She got up before dawn, dressed, walked the 4 blocks to the county recorder's office, and sat on the front step until it opened, because if there was a public record of Larchmont Holdings anywhere in Cedar Bend, she intended to be the first person that morning to see it. Garrett found her there an hour later, still on the step, a ledger balanced on her knees, her handwriting racing across a scrap of paper in tight, economical lines. You didn't wait for me, he said. You didn't say you were coming. I'm here now, so I see. She didn't look up. Larchmont Holdings was registered 14 months ago, filed by an agent, not by Crane directly, which is exactly the kind of caution a man learns after his name gets attached to a federal fraud case once already. 14 months. Garrett sat down beside her on the step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. That's before you ever came to well. Before any of this started between us. Which means he wasn't following me here. Josephine's jaw tightened. He was already here, building something, and I walked straight into the middle of it without knowing. Any names on the filing besides the agent one? She turned the ledger so he could see. Tapped the line with one finger, a silent investor, listed only by initials JC. Garrett went very still. Josephine watched his face change, watched the stillness settle over him that she'd learned these past weeks to read as a thought landing somewhere heavy. Josiah Colby, he said. They found him not deliberately, not at first at the bank, 2 streets over, deep in conversation with the teller about a line of credit, his voice pitched low and confident in the way men speak when they've never once had to worry about being overheard by anyone who mattered. Josiah Colby was a tall man gone soft in the middle, prosperous in the particular way that made a person's collar look permanently too tight. He ran the largest mercantile in 3 counties, and he was, Josephine now understood with a cold, sinking certainty, Beatrice Colby's husband, which explained a great deal, all at once, in the space of a single held breath. She hadn't put it together before, hadn't had reason to. But standing in the doorway of that bank, watching Josiah Colby laugh easily with the teller over some private joke, she understood exactly why Beatrice had gone out of her way, twice now, to humiliate a poor seamstress in public, because a woman married to a man quietly bankrolling a land fraud scheme did not want attention drawn anywhere near her household, ever. And the fastest way to keep attention away from yourself was to make sure it landed, loud and cruel, on somebody else instead. She knows, Josephine said quietly, once they were back out on the street. Beatrice. She might not know the details. She might not want to know the details, but she knows enough. You think that's why she's been so hard on you? I think a woman protecting her household secrets will do almost anything to keep the world's eyes pointed somewhere else. Josephine's voice was flat. Not angry, exactly. Just tired, in the deep, bone-level way that comes from watching a pattern you already know repeat itself one more time. I was an easy target. Poor. Big. Different enough to be talked about without anyone asking too many follow-up questions. Garrett was quiet a moment. That's a hard thing to carry, he said finally. Knowing you were used as a distraction and never even got to choose it. I've carried harder. Doesn't make this one light. She looked at him then, and something eased in her chest that she hadn't given anyone permission to touch in a very long time. Steady. Unhurried, not trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, just standing beside the weight of it with her. No, she admitted. It doesn't, which was, of course, exactly the moment everything got more complicated, because 2 days later, a letter arrived at the Vance ranch. Cream paper. Careful. Formal handwriting. The kind of letter that announces its importance before you've even broken the seal. Garrett read it standing in his own front hall, and Josephine, who had come by that afternoon under the plain, thin excuse of returning a mended jacket, an excuse they both understood by now was mostly just a reason to see each other's faces, watched something shift across his features, something that hadn't been there a moment before. What is it? She asked. The Kesslers. He folded the letter, slow, deliberate, forward. The way a man folds something he needs a moment to be ready to hand over. They're coming to Cedar Bend, within the fortnight. Garrett was quiet a beat too long. My father, he said finally, made an arrangement. Informal. Years back at a dinner before he took ill. He told the Kesslers he hoped our families might be joined, that he considered it a reasonable future between our 2 houses. He met her eyes, steady, though something underneath the steadiness was working hard. Adelaide Kessler is 22. Her family's been operating on the assumption of that promise for 3 years. The shop-mended jacket sat forgotten in Josephine's hands, and now they're coming to collect, she said. Now they're coming to discuss terms. Something cold moved through her chest. Not surprise, exactly. She had told herself, from the very first Tuesday he'd walked through her door, that a man like Garrett attached to exactly this kind of complication. She had simply let herself forget it. Let 3 weeks of quiet Tuesday afternoons and honest conversation talk her out of the very rules she'd built her whole life around. That's not a legal contract, Garrett said quickly, reading her face. Not binding. My father made it informally, over dinner, the way men of a certain generation make those kinds of promises without thinking too hard about the people on the other end of them. Doesn't much matter whether it's binding, Josephine said. Her voice had gone careful, controlled. the voice she used when she needed distance between herself and whatever she was actually feeling. A whole family's been counting on it for 3 years. That's its own kind of weight, whether a judge would recognize it or not. I know that. So what happens when they arrive? I don't know yet, Garrett admitted. And that honesty, the plain, unpolished truth of it, no performance underneath, was somehow worse than if he'd simply promised her everything would be fine. Because Josephine had learned a long time ago not to trust the men who promised everything would be fine. She trusted, more than she wanted to admit even to herself, the ones who told her the truth even when it cost them something. I should go, she said. The shop. Josephine. I'll see you Thursday, Mr. Vance. She left before he could say anything else. Walked the whole way back to town, with her spine very straight and her jaw set hard, and her eyes, for the first time in weeks, doing something dangerously close to spilling over. She did not let them. Not this time either. Because here was the thing nobody warned you about starting to trust someone again after you'd spent years teaching yourself not to. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in small increments, so gradual you barely noticed the ground shifting beneath you. A Tuesday visit here, an honest conversation there, a man who turned his hat in his hands and told you the truth, even when a lie would have been easier, until one day you looked up and realized you'd built something without meaning to. Some fragile, unspoken architecture of hope, standing right where you'd sworn nothing would ever be allowed to stand again. And then a letter arrived. Cream paper, careful handwriting, and the whole fragile structure trembled just slightly under the weight of a promise made by a dead man at a dinner table, years before you'd ever set foot in this town. Josephine sat in her shop that evening with the lamp burning low, a length of unfinished hem forgotten in her lap, and had a very honest conversation with herself, because she was going to get hurt. She understood that now, clearly, the way you understand weather coming in from the west. Not a question of if, only of how hard. Except somewhere in the last 3 weeks, without her permission, without her even noticing it happening, she had stopped believing that getting hurt was the worst possible outcome available to her. Which was, she thought, sitting alone in the lamplight, with her hands finally still, either the beginning of something worth the risk, or the biggest mistake she'd made since Miller County. She honestly did not know which. The gossip found new legs the moment word of the Kessler visit reached Main Street, which it did within a day, Cedar Bend being the kind of town where news traveled faster than any horse could carry it. Beatrice Colby, predictably, made sure the sharpest version circulated widest. I do wonder, Josephine overheard her say to the Sinclair sisters outside the dry goods store, not troubling to lower her voice, whether Mr. Vance's little seamstress understands what's coming for her. A promise between good families isn't so easily set aside. Not for a passing amusement. Josephine kept walking. Didn't slow. Didn't let her face do anything at all. But it landed. Every word of it landed, the way cruelty always did. Straight through whatever armor she'd built. Straight to the soft place underneath that she worked so hard to keep hidden. A passing amusement. She had told herself, hadn't she, on that very first Tuesday, warned herself in exactly those terms. And here was the town simply saying it back to her, louder, crueler, dressed up as concern for her own good. She got through the rest of the day, finished 3 commissions, closed the shop on time, ate supper alone in her room, and read this page of a book 4 times without retaining a single word of it. And when Nell knocked softly on her door that evening, Josephine did not pretend she hadn't been crying, because some walls, even Josephine Larkin's, eventually needed to come down in front of somebody. I heard, Nell said simply, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, about the Kesslers. Everybody's heard. How are you? Fine. Josephine? I'm fine, Nell. Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the second word, betraying the whole sentence. I knew this would happen. I told myself it would happen. I don't get to be surprised now. Knowing a thing's coming, Nell said gently, doesn't make it hurt less when it arrives. Josephine said nothing to that, because it was true, and there was nothing to add to a truth that plain. For what it's worth, Nell added, after a long, quiet moment, I've watched half this town chase after that man's money for years. Never once seen him look at any of them the way he looks at you. That doesn't mean anything, Nell. Not against a promise his own father made. Maybe not, Nell agreed. But it means something to me, and I think, somewhere under all that careful armor of yours, it means something to you too. Josephine didn't answer. She didn't have to. Nell already knew. The Kesslers arrived on a Thursday, which meant the shop was busy, which meant Josephine had exactly no time that day to think about anything except thread counts and pickup orders and the particular chaos of a Founder's Day season, winding toward its final weekend event, the annual ranch auction, the largest gathering Cedar Bend hosted outside the festival itself, which was in its own strange way a mercy, because a busy hand left less room for a spiraling mind. She heard about the family's arrival secondhand, the way she heard most things now, filtered through Nell, who had it from the station master, who had apparently watched the whole event unfold with the breathless attention of a man witnessing a small piece of history. A well-dressed older couple. Their daughter, Adelaide Young, composed, the kind of quiet beauty that suggested careful upbringing and very little practice being told no, and an elderly woman traveling with them. The grandmother, Eugenia Kessler, matriarch of the family, apparently insistent on making the journey herself despite her age and the protests of everyone around her. Josephine received this information the way she received most difficult things now, with her hands steady on her work and her face arranged into something calm, something that gave nothing away. "Thank you, Nell," she said in a tone that clearly closed the subject. Nell, showing more restraint than Josephine had thought her capable of, let it close. The ranch auction fell on a Saturday, bright and hot, the kind of late summer day that made the whole territory smell of dust and cut grass and horses. Josephine had not planned to attend. She told herself, with perfectly sound logic, that there was no reason for her to stand in a crowded square where every eye in the county would inevitably drift toward her at some point, comparing her, without ever saying so out loud, to a composed young woman from a good family who had every advantage Josephine had never once been offered, except Nell had pointed out, with characteristic bluntness, that staying home would look exactly like hiding. And Josephine Larkin had not hidden from anything in 6 years. She was not about to start now, on account of a woman half her age with a prettier dress and an easier life. So she went. She positioned herself near the eastern edge of the square, close enough to see, far enough to have a reason to be there, that didn't require explaining herself to anyone. The morning moved around her in its ordinary chaos, livestock changing hands, men calling bids, a whole community busy performing its own prosperity for one bright, dusty afternoon. She saw Garrett across the square within the first 10 minutes, talking business with 2 older ranchers, hat on, arms crossed, the posture of a man handling something efficiently. She saw the Kessler family shortly after. Adelaide, exactly as described, composed, lovely, dressed in pale blue, that made her look like she'd stepped directly out of a more forgiving story than the one Josephine was currently living inside of. And beside her, moving slowly, leaning on a cane, an elderly woman with silver hair and sharp, watchful eyes. Eugenia Kessler. Josephine watched them for a long moment, watched the careful distance the family kept from the auction crowd's rougher edges, watched Adelaide's polite, practiced smile, and felt something small and mean rise up in her own chest that she was not proud of. Comparison. The oldest, ugliest habit a woman could fall into. She pushed it down, told herself it wasn't fair to Adelaide, who hadn't asked for any of this either, who was likely just as trapped by a dead man's dinner table promise as Josephine was. She was still telling herself that when the world came apart, it happened fast, which was the thing about disasters, they never announced themselves politely. One moment the square was its ordinary chaos of bids and horses and dust. The next, a supply wagon at the far edge of the grounds lurched hard against a broken wheel brace, and the team pulling it 2 big draft horses, already unsettled by the noise and heat spooked. Hard. The wagon lurched sideways. Crate slid loose, crashed down onto the ground with a splintering crack that only made the horses worse. And then they were running. Straight through the crowd. No driver at the reins, he'd been thrown clear on the first hard jolt, rolling into the dirt, stunned, useless. Screaming started. People scattering. The kind of sudden animal chaos that overtakes a crowd faster than thought. And directly in the wagon's path, frozen, one hand braced on her cane, too slow, too old, too far from anywhere safe, stood Eugenia Kessler. Josephine didn't think. That was the truth of it. Later, when people asked her, and they did ask, again and again, in the weeks that followed, wanting to know what had gone through her mind in that moment, the honest answer was nothing. Nothing went through her mind. Her body simply moved, faster than thought had any chance to catch up to it, closing the distance across the square in a handful of long, driving strides. She reached the old woman a half-second before the horses did. Didn't stop to think about size, or grace, or what a smaller woman might have managed instead. She threw her full weight into the lead horse's bridle strap, hauling down and sideways with everything 6 feet, and 3 inches of hard-earned strength could give her, digging her boot heels into the churned dirt, arms burning, shoulders screaming, the animal's panic transferring straight through the leather into her own body like a current. The horse fought her, reared, half-dragged her off her feet. She held with both hands locked, white-knuckled around the strap, held with her whole body braced low and immovable, held the way she had learned to hold everything else in her life that threatened to knock her flat, refusing, simply refusing, to let go. The wagon slewed hard sideways instead of straight through, missed Eugenia Kessler by a margin no wider than a hand's width, crashed instead into an empty vendor stall, splintering wood, scattering nothing but boards and dust, and then all at once it was over. The horses stood trembling, spent, finally still. Josephine stood with them, chest heaving, hands still locked on the bridle, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline she hadn't given herself permission to feel until just this second. The square had gone completely, utterly silent, every single person in it staring at her. "You could have been killed," Eugenia Kessler said. Her voice was not shaking, which surprised Josephine, given everything. The old woman stood exactly where she'd frozen, cane back under one hand, watching Josephine with sharp, assessing eyes that had clearly seen a great deal in a long life and were not easily rattled even now. "So could you?" Josephine managed. Her own voice came out rougher than she intended. "Ma'am, I'm 81 years old. I've had my share of years." Eugenia's gaze didn't waver. "You are considerably younger than that." Didn't have time to do the arithmetic. Something moved across the old woman's face. Not quite a smile. Closer to genuine surprise. The kind that comes from encountering something you hadn't expected and don't yet know how to categorize. "What is your name, girl?" "Josephine Larkin, ma'am." "Larkin." Eugenia repeated it slowly, like she was turning it over, filing it away someplace it would not be easily lost again. "I understand you're the young woman my granddaughter's family has traveled a very long way to discuss business about." Josephine's stomach dropped straight through the ground. "I don't know what you mean, ma'am. I think you know exactly what I mean." Eugenia's eyes were not unkind, just very, very direct. "I also think you just risked your own life to save a stranger's," without pausing 1/2 second to consider whether that stranger's family had any particular reason to be fond of you. She tilted her head slightly, studying Josephine the way one studies a piece of furniture, whose craftsmanship turns out to be a great deal finer than the price tag suggested. "That tells a person a good deal about your character, Miss Larkin. A good deal more than any amount of town gossip ever could." Josephine didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all, which, in its own way, was the truest answer she had. Garrett reached her a moment later, pushing through the loosening crowd, his face pale under the tan, his hands closing around her shoulders like he needed to physically confirm she was still standing, still whole, still breathing. "You're all right. Not a question. A demand for it to be true. I'm all right." "Josephine." "I'm all right, Garrett," softer this time. Her hands, she realized, were still shaking. She let him see it. Didn't try to hide it, for once. Didn't perform the careful composure she usually wore like armor. "Ask me again in an hour. I might have a different answer." Something in his face cracked open at that. Relief mostly, but underneath the relief, something else. Something that had been building for 3 weeks and had just been given an enormous, terrifying reason to arrive all at once. He didn't say it there. Not with half the town still staring, still buzzing, still recovering from the fright of it all. But she saw it sitting behind his eyes, plain as anything. And for the first time, since the letter with the cream paper had arrived, Josephine let herself believe, just slightly, that whatever was coming for them wasn't finished being written yet. The Kesslers requested a private word that same evening. Not the whole family. Just Adelaide, composed even now, though something in her bearing had softened considerably since the morning's chaos, and Eugenia, who insisted on attending despite everyone's protests that she ought to be resting. They met at the Vance Ranch house, at Eugenia's specific request, because, as she put it, plainly, to nobody's argument, "I did not travel 100 miles to have this conversation in a hotel parlor." Josephine came too. Garrett had asked her to, which was, itself, a kind of statement that, whatever was about to be discussed, he did not intend to have it happen anywhere. She wasn't present to hear it firsthand. "I'll say this plainly," Eugenia began. Once they were all seated, her cane propped against her chair, her sharp eyes moving between Garrett and Josephine with unhurried thoroughness. "My son-in-law came to Cedar Bend prepared to discuss an obligation he believes your late father made to our family. I have listened to that argument the entire journey here, and I confess I have never once found it entirely convincing." Grandmother Adelaide started. "Let me finish, child." Eugenia's voice was gentle but immovable. "A promise made by a dying man over supper, hoping his son might find happiness with a good family, is not the same as a contract. It never was. I told your father as much before we left home, and he did not want to hear it. And I have found, in 81 years, that men rarely want to hear the truth when it interferes with what they've already decided to want." She turned to Garrett directly. "Mr. Vance, I watched a woman throw her entire body between my granddaughter's family and a runaway wagon this morning without 1 second's hesitation and without one single reason to expect any gratitude for it beyond the plain decency of the act itself." Her gaze moved, deliberate, to Josephine. "That is not a passing amusement, Miss Larkin. Whatever this town has been whispering, I've lived long enough to recognize the genuine article when I see it. Standing in front of me, covered in dust and horse sweat, still shaking, still refusing to make a fuss about it." Josephine's throat had gone tight. "As for our family's business," Eugenia continued, turning back to Garrett, "I release you from whatever imagined obligation my son-in-law believes exists. Formally, and with my blessing behind it, which in this family carries considerably more weight than his objections." "Grandmother, truly," Adelaide said quietly, and something in her voice had settled, gentle and clear. "I never wanted an arrangement built on a promise I had no part in making. I'd rather wait my whole life for something real than accept something owed." The room went quiet a moment. Not uncomfortable. Just full, the way a room gets when something important has finally, cleanly, resolved itself. "Thank you," Garrett said finally. To both of them. "Truly." "Don't thank me yet," Eugenia said, and something sharper returned to her voice. Something that told them the conversation was not, in fact, finished. "Because there's a second matter I came here to discuss, and it concerns a piece of land my late husband left our family, and a company that's been sniffing around it for the better part of a year, offering considerably less than it's worth, and pressing considerably harder than good business generally requires." Josephine went very still. "The company's name," she said, carefully. "Would it happen to be Larchmont Holdings?" Eugenia's sharp eyes narrowed. "How?" she said slowly. "Would you already know that?" The room went very quiet. Because here it was, the thread pulling tighter, drawing 3 separate wounds: Josephine's family, the Vance family's old business, and now the Kesslers into one single, ugly knot, all of it running back to the same patient, careful hand. "Silas Crane," Josephine said. "He operated under a different name in Miller County. He took my family's land the same way 6 years ago. I have every reason to believe Larchmont Holdings is his newest disguise." Eugenia's face went hard, not shocked exactly. Something closer to grim confirmation, the expression of a woman who had suspected something ugly for a long time and had just watched her suspicion be proven correct. "He's been pressuring my son-in-law directly," she said. "Small offers at first, reasonable enough to seem harmless. Then larger ones, tied to strange conditions. Documentation requests that made no sense for an honest purchase. My son-in-law is not a fool, Miss Larkin, but he is a busy man, and busy men sometimes miss what a more careful eye would catch." "How much land?" Garrett asked. "The northern section. Runs along the river." Eugenia's jaw tightened. "The best water access on the whole property." Josephine and Garrett exchanged a look, a long one, because that detailed water access, the single most valuable feature of any parcel in this dry territory, was exactly the kind of thing a man like Crane would engineer his name around. "We're not the only family he's after," Josephine said quietly. "There will be others. There always are with a man like this. He doesn't stop. He simply moves to the next name on his list." "Then it seems," Eugenia said, straightening in her chair with the steel of a woman who had just found a fight worth having, "that my family's business and yours have become considerably more entangled than a dead man's dinner promise ever managed to make them." She looked between Josephine and Garrett, something almost approving in her sharp old eyes. "What do you intend to do about it?" They talked long into the evening, longer than Josephine had talked with anyone about anything in years. The Kesslers' documents laid out beside Amos's fragmented memories, beside the county recorder's ledger, beside the surveyor's mark that had started the whole unraveling on a dusty road 3 weeks earlier. By the time the Kesslers finally departed for their hotel, a plan had begun to take shape, rough, incomplete, but real. They would need more than memory and suspicion. They would need documents, original filings. A lawyer who understood territorial land law well enough to trace a fraud 6 years old through 3 different counties, and at least 2 false names. Josephine knew exactly where such documents might still exist. Miller County. A lawyer named Nathaniel Cross, who had tried once to help her father and had failed, and had carried that failure with him ever since, the way she carried her own. "We'll need to go there," she said. Once the house had emptied, once it was only her and Garrett left in the quiet ranch parlor, the lamp burning low, the whole enormous day finally catching up to both of them at once. "Miller County. Soon. I'll come with you. You have a ranch to run." "I have a foreman," Garrett said, who spent the last several weeks proving, in the hardest way possible, exactly how much he's willing to make right. "I think Amos can manage 2 weeks without me." Josephine looked at him a long moment. Something held in her chest, that fragile architecture she'd been so afraid of, standing right where nothing was supposed to be allowed to stand again. It didn't crumble, didn't even tremble this time. "All right," she said. The town's mood shifted in the days that followed, quiet but unmistakable, the way weather shifts before anyone quite names the change out loud. The story of the runaway wagon traveled faster even than the earlier gossip had, and this version came with no cruelty attached to it. No whispered comparisons, no cutting asides about size or station. Just plain, wide-eyed accounts of a seamstress who had thrown herself in front of a runaway team without a single second's hesitation, saving an elderly woman's life in front of half the county. Josephine caught the change everywhere. In the dry goods store, where the clerk who'd once served her with barely concealed disdain now asked, genuinely, after her well-being. In church, where 2 women who had never once spoken to her directly stopped to thank her, awkward but sincere, for what she'd done. It didn't erase 6 years of being looked at sideways. She understood that. One act of courage, however dramatic, however widely discussed, did not undo a lifetime's accumulation of unkindness. But it cracked something open, something that had felt for a very long time permanently sealed. And Beatrice Colby predictably, unmistakably went very quiet. Josephine saw her once across the street in the days after. Beatrice did not approach, did not offer any cutting remark, any pointed silence designed to travel. She simply looked at Josephine for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her carefully composed face, and then turned and walked the other way. Josephine understood, without being told, exactly what that silence meant. Beatrice knew her husband's name sat somewhere on a Larchmont Holdings filing, and for the first time since Thursday, she was afraid of what that fact might cost her. The final confrontation Josephine had not planned came 2 days before she and Garrett were set to leave for Miller County. She was closing the shop for the evening, the lamp already dimmed, when the bell above the door rang one last time. Beatrice Colby stood in the doorway, alone, no Sinclair sisters flanking her this time, no armor of accompaniment at all, Mrs. Colby. Josephine kept her voice even. "We're closed, I won't take long." Beatrice's hands were folded tight in front of her, knuckles pale. "I came to ask you something, and I'd rather ask it plainly than continue pretending I don't already suspect the answer." Josephine waited. "My husband's business dealings," Beatrice said. "Larchmont Holdings. You know something about it. The whole town's heard the rumors by now, one way or another." "I know a great deal about it," Josephine said. Careful. Level, more than I'd like to. Beatrice's composure trembled, just slightly at the edges. "Is he?" She stopped, started again, quieter. "Is my husband part of something that will ruin us?" Josephine looked at her for a long moment. Because here was a woman who had thrown Josephine's wages in the mud, mocked her size, her poverty, her whole existence, in front of half the town, more than once, without a single flicker of remorse. And here, now, was the same woman standing in her doorway, stripped of every ounce of that armor, asking a plain, frightened question with nowhere left to hide it. "I don't know the full shape of what your husband's involved in, Josephine said finally. I know his name sits on a filing connected to a man who has ruined at least one family that I know of personally, and likely several more besides. What that means for you and your household, that's not something I can answer, Mrs. Colby. That's something only your husband can. Beatrice's jaw tightened. You could have simply told me nothing, she said. Let me walk out of here not knowing. I could have. Why didn't you? Josephine thought about the answer a long moment. Thought about Miller County, about her father, about 6 years of watching a lie sit comfortably in a public record while the truth waited, buried, for someone brave enough to dig it back up. Because I know what it costs a family to lose everything to a man like that, she said. And I wouldn't wish that particular cruelty on anyone, not even someone who's been cruel to me. Beatrice stood very still. Get him. Good evening, Miss Larkin, she said finally, her voice unsteady in a way Josephine had never once heard from her. She left without another word. Josephine stood alone in the darkened shop a long while after, turning the whole strange exchange over in her mind, and found Pawnawind, somewhere underneath all 6 years of careful defenses, a small, quiet space that felt, unexpectedly, like something close to peace. She thought, standing there, reduced about how easily cruelty and fear could wear the exact same face in this town, how a woman like Beatrice Colby, who had never once had to fight for anything in her life, could still end up cornered by the same kind of dread that had followed Josephine since she was 20 years old. It didn't excuse what Beatrice had done. Josephine wasn't in the business of handing out excuses she hadn't earned the right to give, but it made the woman easier to understand, and understanding didn't fruit. She was learning. Fenwick cost a great deal less than hatred and lasted considerably longer. She locked the shop door behind her that night, thinking not of Silas Crane, for once, but of every woman in Cedar Bend who had ever been made small by someone else's fear, and of how much of that smallness, given the right kind of courage, might still be undone. The night before they left for Miller County, Garrett came to the shop one last time, not for a repair, not for any pretense at all. He simply stood in the doorway, hat in his hand, the same way he had that very first Tuesday, and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her. She realized now, since the moment she'd risen up out of the mud on Founder's Day, with her chin still level and her eyes still dry. I need to say something, he said, before we go. Before this gets any more complicated than it already is. Garrett, let me finish. Please. She let him finish. I've watched this town look past you for years, by every account I've heard. Watched them call you strange for being taller than the men who were supposed to court you. Watched them treat your strength like something to whisper about, instead of something to admire. His voice was steady, certain. Nothing performed in it at all. I don't want a smaller version of you, Josephine. I don't want you folded down to fit some shape, this town decided was easier to look at. I've watched you plant your feet in front of a runaway team without a second's hesitation, and I've watched you pick coins up out of the mud without ever once bending your spine to do it, and I am telling you plainly, I want exactly the size of you. All of it. I'm not interested in anything less. Josephine stood very still. Because here, finally, after 6 years of careful walls and quiet accounting, and every hard lesson she'd taught herself about what men like this actually wanted, here was a man saying the one thing she had never once let herself believe she'd hear, not despite what she was, because of it. Ask me again, she said, her voice breaking just slightly on the words. Once we've dealt with Miller County. Once we know what we're truly walking into. I don't want to answer you standing in the middle of everything still unresolved. Fair enough, Garrett said. I'll ask you again the moment it's finished. He left, and Josephine stood alone in her shop one final time. Before the long journey ahead, her hand pressed flat against her own chest, feeling something there she hadn't dared to feel in 6 long years. Not safety exactly. Nothing about what lay ahead promised safety, but hope. Careful, hard-won, entirely unfamiliar hope. And for the first time since Miller County had taken everything from her, Josephine Larkin found she was not afraid of what came next. She was ready for it. Miller County looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing that struck Josephine, stepping down from the train with Garrett beside her, the platform dust settling around her boots. Not different exactly. Smaller. The way a childhood room shrinks when you walk back into it, as a grown woman, the same walls, the same window, but somehow no longer large enough to hold what you remember it holding. 6 years. She hadn't set foot here in 6 years. and every single building along the main street seemed to know it. The dry goods store where her mother used to trade eggs for thread. The church where they'd buried her father in a plot too small, too plain, for a man who'd built something honest with his own two hands. The road out toward the old farm, still there, still running the same direction it always had, indifferent to everything it had watched happen along its edges. "You don't have to do this," Garrett said quietly, watching her face. "I know. That's not the same as saying you should." Josephine looked at him. The tightness in her chest, there for the whole train ride, loosened just a fraction at the plane, unhurried kindness of it, no pressure, no performance, just a man leaving the door open in case she needed it. "I'm not avoiding hard things anymore," she said. "I decided that a while back. Somewhere around a runaway wagon, I think." Garrett almost smiled. "Not quite. Close enough, all right," he said. "Then let's go find your lawyer." Nathaniel Cross's office sat above the hardware store, same as it always had, the stairs creaking in the exact places Josephine remembered from childhood. Third step. Seventh step, the landing just before the door. She knocked, and the man who opened it was older than she remembered. 10 hard years of small-town practice carved into his face, but his eyes were sharp. And the moment he saw her standing there, something immediate and unguarded broke across his features. "Miss Larkin, Mr. Cross." He looked at her a long moment, looked at Garrett, looked back at her, taking in the whole shape of what 6 years had made of her taller, it seemed to him, than he remembered treating her, though she supposed she'd simply grown into whatever height she'd already reached as a girl. "I hoped you'd come," he said. "God help me, I hoped you'd come, and I dreaded it in equal measure. Please, come in." The office was the organized chaos of a man who knew exactly where everything was and could not have explained the system to a living soul. He cleared 2 chairs of paper, sat across from them, and before either Josephine or Garrett could say a single word about why they'd come, he drew a long breath and started talking. Like a man who had rehearsed this confession alone in an empty room more times than he cared to count. "There's something I should have done years ago," he said. "I want to say it before we discuss anything else. Before she asked me a single question." Josephine waited, because some things needed room to be said in their own shape without interruption. "After your father's case was lost," Cross went on, "after the transfer went through, and there was nothing left to appeal, I found something. A prior transaction. Crane had run the same scheme in another county, years before yours. Same buried clause, same technique nearly word for word. A judge in that county had flagged it as likely fraudulent at the time, though it was never formally prosecuted. Crane had already moved on. The other family accepted the loss and went quiet. The way families do when fighting feels like it costs more than it could ever win back." "You had proof," Josephine said. Her voice had gone very still. "I had proof," Cross agreed. 6 weeks before your father died, I was preparing to bring it to the federal circuit. It wouldn't have reversed the land transfer, that door was already shut by then, but it might have forced an earlier investigation. It might have given your family the documented truth instead of the version this county chose to believe instead. Why didn't you file it?" Cross's hands, folded on the desk between them, had begun to tremble, slight but unmistakable. "I was a small practice," he said. "One man. Crane Stills had influence in this county at the time. I was afraid of what fighting him directly would cost me." He looked up and his eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it. "Your father died before I found my nerve. By the time I finally sent the documentation forward 2 years later, when the federal case against Crane was finally being built, I sent it anonymously. I have been ashamed of that single word every day since. Anonymously, as though the truth wasn't worth my own name attached to it." The room went very quiet. Josephine sat with what he'd said, let it settle, the way she'd learned to let hard things settle, instead of flinching away from them. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter," she said finally. "It does matter. My father spent his last months believing he'd failed us through his own carelessness. A different truth, spoken to sooner, might have changed something for him. Might not have. Neither of us gets to know that now." She held his gaze steadily. "But I understand fear, Mr. Cross. I understand exactly what it costs to stand in the gap between what's right and what you actually manage to do. I'm not here to punish you for having stood in that gap yourself. Then why are you here?" "For the documentation," Josephine said. "And because Silas Crane is operating in Cedar Bend under a new name, doing this to at least 2 more families that I already know of. I intend to stop him properly this time, not anonymously." Not quietly. I need everything you have. Nathaniel Cross closed his eyes a moment. When he opened them, something in his face had changed. Steadied. I have everything you need, he said. They spent 2 full days in that cluttered office, and Josephine understood, somewhere in the middle of the first afternoon, that this was the work she had been building toward, without ever fully naming it. Not just sewing, not just survival, but this: reading, tracing, finding the exact place where a lie had been dressed up to look like truth, and pulling the thread until the whole disguise came apart in her hands. Cross had kept everything. 12 years of archived records, organized with the precise, obsessive care of a man who had been waiting, whether he'd admitted it to himself or not, for exactly this moment. Josephine found the pattern by the second afternoon. Here, she spread 3 documents across the desk, tapping each one in turn. Miller County, 1876. My father's contract. The clause buried on page 3, dressed up in language nobody, without legal training, would think twice about. She slid the second document beside it. The other county, the one you mentioned. Same clause. Nearly identical wording. Just enough change to avoid looking copied to anyone not reading closely. And the third, Larchmont Holdings, Cedar Bend, filed 14 months ago. Same surveyor's mark in the corner. Same silent investor structure. He hasn't changed his method in 6 years, Mr. Cross. He's simply gotten better at hiding his own name behind it. Cross studied the 3 papers a long moment. That's enough to build a case, he said. More than enough if we can get someone in Cedar Bend to testify to the recent dealings directly. Garrett, who had been quiet through most of the afternoon, letting Josephine work the way she needed to work, finally spoke. Amos will testify, he said. He's already told us everything he remembers. He'll say it in front of a judge, if that's what it takes. And Josiah Colby's wife, Josephine added slowly, thinking it through, even as she said it. Beatrice. She came to me before we left Cedar Bend, frightened, wanting to know if her husband's business would ruin her family. I think if we approach her carefully, she might be willing to help us, if it means protecting whatever's left of her own name once this becomes public. You'd trust her, Garrett said. Not quite a question. I don't trust her, Josephine said honestly. But I understand her. A frightened woman with something to lose will often do the right thing, provided the right thing also happens to save her. Cross looked between the two of them, something almost admiring settling into his tired, weathered face. Then it sounds, he said, as though you two have already built the better part of this case without me. They returned to Cedar Bend 11 days after they'd left F, the whole territory gone gold and dry with late summer, the light stretching long and amber across the grasslands as the train pulled in. Josephine had expected to feel exhausted. She did feel exhausted in the honest, bone-deep way that came from 2 weeks of reading contracts, until her eyes ached and sleeping badly in unfamiliar beds. But underneath the exhaustion sat something else, something steadier. Purpose, plain and simple. She had gone to Miller County, half afraid of what she'd find in herself, standing again in the middle of everything that had once broken her family apart. What she'd found instead was a woman who could read a fraudulent contract faster and more precisely than most trained clerks, who had built, out of 6 years of grief and careful vigilance, an actual skill sharp enough to be useful. Her father hadn't had anyone to read his contracts for him. She had made very sure, without ever fully realizing she was doing it, that she would never again be that kind of unprepared. Beatrice Colby agreed to meet her the very next morning, not at the shop. At the small church on the edge of town, empty at that hour, quiet enough for a conversation neither woman wanted overheard. You came back, Beatrice said, standing near the front pew, her hands folded tight, the way they'd been the last time Josephine saw her. I told you I would deal with it properly, and have you? I've built the case, Josephine said. Documented, dated, connected across 3 counties. Silas Crane is Larchmont Holdings. Your husband's name sits on the filing as a silent investor. She let that land a moment before continuing, gentler than she might have managed a month earlier. I'm not here to destroy your family, Mrs. Colby. I'm here because I need someone with direct knowledge of your husband's dealings to speak plainly, in front of a judge, about what he knew and when. Beatrice's composure trembled. If I speak against him, she said quietly, I lose everything too. My name, my standing. Whatever's left of this life I've built. You might, Josephine agreed. Honest, because she owed this woman honesty even now, even after everything. Or you might be the one person in this whole affair who chose to tell the truth before it was forced out of her. That's worth something, Mrs. Colby. In this town, and in whatever life comes after it. Beatrice was quiet a long moment, looking at nothing. Looking perhaps at some version of her own life she hadn't let herself examine too closely in a very long time. He told me it was a sound investment, she said finally. Very low. Land speculation. Nothing more. I chose to believe him, because believing him was easier than asking the questions I already half suspected the answers to. She looked up, and something in her face had gone raw, unguarded, entirely unlike the woman who had dropped coins in the mud in front of half the town. I threw your wages in the dirt because I needed the world to keep looking anywhere but at my own household. I knew that even as I did it. I am not proud of it, I know, Josephine said simply. Will you forgive me for it? Josephine considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. I don't know yet, she admitted. But I can work alongside you towards something true, whether or not forgiveness has caught up to it yet. Sometimes that has to be enough for now. Beatrice nodded, slow, and something in her seemed, for the first time since Josephine had known her, to settle into something like relief. I'll testify, she said, whatever it costs me. The hearing was set for the following week, and Josephine spent every one of the 7 evenings between then and now at the ranch kitchen table. Papers spread out under the lamp in the same careful order. She gave her ribbon spools, building the argument the way she built a garment measure first, cut once, never twice. Garrett sat across from her most of those evenings, not directing, not correcting, just present, the way he'd learned to be present with her over these past months. On the 5th night, he finally asked the question she could tell had been sitting behind his teeth for days. Why not let Cross argue it? He's the lawyer, because a lawyer arguing my father's case is reading a story out loud, Josephine said, not looking up from the document in front of her. I want the judge to see the person the fraud actually happened to. I want him to look at me and understand that this isn't an abstraction on a page. It's a family. It's a man who died believing he'd failed the people he loved. She finally looked up. Cross can stand beside me. He can catch what I miss. But I'll be the one who says it. That's going to be hard to stand up and do. Harder than picking coins up out of the mud in front of half this town. Something dry moved at the corner of her mouth, the closest thing to a joke she'd managed in days. I've had practice standing in front of people who'd rather I wasn't there, Garrett. I don't intend to let a courtroom be any different. He watched her a long moment, something quietly fierce settling into his expression. No, he agreed. I don't suppose you will. She rehearsed the argument twice more that week, once out loud to Nell, who cried through the entire recitation and then insisted on hearing it a second time, so she could cry through it properly, and once to Amos, who listened with his hat in his hands and told her, when she finished, that her father would have been prouder of the woman standing in front of him than of any acre of land he'd ever lost. Josephine did not cry at that. She came close. But she had work still to finish, and she had learned, a long time ago, that grief and preparation could share a room together without either one crowding the other out entirely. The courtroom was full the morning of the hearing. Fuller than Josephine had expected, though she supposed a scandal this size, touching this many respectable names, was exactly the kind of spectacle a small territorial town rarely got to witness firsthand. Silas Crane sat at the defense table, and Josephine saw him in person for the first time in 6 years. He looked smaller than she remembered. That was the strange, almost disappointing thing about it. The man who had haunted her nightmares as a girl, who had sat across her father's kitchen table with his smiling, patient cruelty, turned out, in the cold light of a courtroom, to be nothing more than an aging man in an expensive coat, his hands folded, his expression carefully, professionally composed. He looked at her once, across the room, as she took her place at the front, and whatever he'd expected to see in her face, fear, perhaps, or the particular hesitation of a woman who once frightened girl in his presence, he did not find it. Josephine held his gaze exactly as long as she needed to, then looked away, because he had already taken enough of her attention for one lifetime, and she was not inclined to hand over any more of it than the law required. The judge called the proceeding to order, and Nathaniel Cross rose first, laying the historical groundwork, the Miller County contract, the flagged fraud from years earlier, the documented pattern of Crane's method across multiple counties. Then it was Josephine's turn. She stood, steadied the leather case in her hands. Her heart was going hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, and she let it. She had learned somewhere in the last 6 years that fear and readiness could occupy the same body at the same time, and that waiting for the fear to leave before you acted was its own kind of trap. "This document," she said, holding up the first paper, her voice carrying clean through the packed courtroom, "is my father's original land contract, dated 1876. This clause here, on the third page, uses language nearly identical to a contract flagged as fraudulent in a neighboring county that same year." She set it down, picked up the next. "This is the founding filing for Larchmont Holdings, registered in Cedar Bend 14 months ago. The surveyor's mark in this corner matches the mark on my father's original contract exactly. Same hand, same method. 6 years apart, and nothing about the technique has changed." She looked up, found Crane's eyes across the room. "I am not a lawyer," she said. "I am a seamstress. I learned to read contracts the hard way because my father did not have anyone to read his for him, and I promised myself, standing over his grave, that I would never again be caught unprepared by a man who built his fortune on exactly that kind of unpreparedness." A murmur moved through the room. Crane's composed expression flickered, just slightly for the first time. "I am asking this court," Josephine continued, "not only to recognize what was done to my family 6 years ago, but to stop what is currently being done right now to at least 2 more families in this county, under a new name and a new disguise, by the same patient hand." Amos Tate testified next. He stood in the witness box, hat in his hands, and told the room, plainly, without flinching, everything he had confessed to Josephine and Garrett weeks earlier in the quiet dark of the barn, the desk full of documents, the delivery he'd made as a grown man that he hadn't thought was his place to question, the 3 long years of silence he had kept afterward, once he understood what he'd seen. "I should have spoken sooner," he said, his weathered voice carrying clear across the courtroom. "I know that. I'm not asking anyone here to think better of me for finally doing it now this late. I'm just telling the truth, plain as I can, because it's long past due." Beatrice Colby testified after him, her voice unsteady but unwavering, laying out her husband's involvement in careful, damning detail, the silent investment, the documents she'd found and chosen for too long not to examine too closely. Josiah Colby, seated in the gallery, went visibly pale as his wife spoke. He did not look at her once during her entire testimony. By the time the final witness stepped down, the courtroom had gone entirely silent, the particular room that understood it was watching something significant settle into place. The judge did not deliberate long. Silas Crane's operations, present and past, were placed under formal federal investigation, the Larchmont Holdings filing frozen pending review. The Kessler family's northern parcel was protected outright, the pressured offers voided, and the court ordered this was the part Josephine had not fully allowed herself to hope for, right up until the moment the words were actually spoken aloud, a formal amendment to the Miller County record, her father's name corrected, not restitution. The land itself was long gone, sold and resold, legitimately transferred through 2 further ownerships in the years since. There was no pathway back to that. Josephine had understood that walking in, and she understood it still, standing there as the judge's words settled over the courtroom. But the lie that had lived quietly in the public record for 6 years, the version that painted her father as careless, as somehow deserving of what had happened to him, was gone now, replaced with the truth, written down, permanent in the exact place the lie had once lived. Josephine stood very still as the gavel came down. She did not cry in the courtroom. But when she finally stepped outside, into the bright, ordinary afternoon light, and felt Garrett's hand find hers, without either of them saying a word about it, she let herself feel finally, all the way through, exactly how heavy the last 6 years had been, and exactly how much lighter she suddenly felt, standing here having finally set that weight down. Silas Crane was led away in restraints 2 days later, bound over for federal trial, his composed, patient smile nowhere in evidence by the time the marshals walked him out the courthouse's back door. Josephine did not go to watch. She had already said everything she needed to say to that man, in the one room and the one moment where it actually mattered. She spent that day, instead, in her own shop, hemming a dress order that had waited patiently through everything, thread moving steady between her fingers, the ordinary rhythm of the work settling something, in her chest that even the courtroom's justice hadn't quite reached. Because justice, she was learning, Fenway, however satisfying, however long overdue, was not the same thing as peace. Peace, it turned out, looked more like this: a quiet shop, steady hands, a life finally fully her own. Garrett found her there that evening, the shop lamp burning low, the last of the day's light gone gold and soft through the front window. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, the way he had that very first Tuesday, hat in his hand, watching her work with the patient attention she had come, over these past weeks, to recognize as entirely, uniquely his. "You said to ask you again," he said finally. Josephine set down her needle, looked up. "I remember, it's resolved." "But mostly," she agreed. Something warm and unfamiliar moved through her. "Entirely welcome. The federal trial's still ahead. The Colby family's got a hard road in front of them. Nothing in this life ever gets fully cleanly finished, Garrett. I've learned that much, if nothing else." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He crossed the shop floor, slow, unhurried, and knelt, an old-fashioned gesture. She'd think, later, laughing about it, though in the moment, it simply took every ounce of breath straight out of her chest. "But I'm not asking you to wait for a perfectly finished life, Josephine. I'm asking you to build an imperfect, ongoing, entirely real one, with me, however much of it's still unresolved." He held up a ring, plain gold, narrow. His mother's, he'd tell her later, left to him with instructions to give it to someone who'd wear it honestly and not for appearances. "Josephine Larkin," he said, "will you marry me?" Josephine looked at the ring, looked at him, this steady, plain-spoken man who had watched her rise up out of the mud on a dusty Founder's Day morning and had never once, in all the weeks since, asked her to be smaller, quieter, easier to look at than she actually was. "Yes," she said. No hesitation at all. "Yes, Garrett, I will." They were married in October, at the little church on the edge of town, on a morning when the cottonwoods had gone gold, and the air carried that sharp, honest clarity that came to the territory only in autumn. The ceremony was small, because Josephine had asked for small, and what Josephine asked for by then generally happened without much argument. Nell Osborne cried through the entire service from the second pew, making no effort at all to hide it. Amos Tate stood near the back, hat in his hands, wearing the settled, quiet expression of a man who had finally made peace with an old debt. Eugenia Kessler attended, sharp-eyed and approving, seated beside a considerably more subdued Adelaide, who caught Josephine's eye at one point during the vows, and offered her a small, genuine, entirely unguarded smile. Beatrice Colby came too, alone, sat near the back, and left before the reception without speaking to anyone, though Josephine saw her go and understood, without needing a single word exchanged, exactly what courage it had taken for that particular woman to show up at all. The reception was held at the ranch, tables set long across the yard, the fiddle music carrying warm and easy through the autumn afternoon. Josephine had organized the food herself, not because she had to, but because organizing things had become, somewhere along this whole long journey, less a burden and more simply a piece of who she was. At some point in the evening, standing at the edge of the gathering with a cup of cider in her hand, she found herself alone for a moment, looking out at the whole accumulated fact of her life as it currently stood. A husband, a ranch, a corrected record, framed now, hanging in the front hall of the house that was, unbelievably, also hers. A proposal already drafted in her own careful handwriting for something she'd started calling, quietly, not yet publicly, the Larkin Workroom, a cooperative shop where women with real skill and no other means could work under a shared roof, sharing costs, sharing profit, owning a piece of something instead of simply selling their labor to whoever happened to own it all. Garrett found her there, the way he always knew how to be quiet exactly when quiet was needed. "You're planning something," he said. "I'm planning several things. The workroom, among others." He was quiet a moment. "You know," he said finally, "you don't have to carry all of it alone anymore. The planning, any of it." Josephine looked at him. This steady, patient man who had read her business proposal 3 times before she'd even known he'd seen it once, who had knelt on the floor of her own shop and asked her to marry him, not despite the size and shape and strength of who she was, but entirely, unreservedly, because of it. "Well, I know," she said. "Old habits. Some habits kept you alive when you needed them to. Some of them did, she agreed. I don't intend to lose all of them, just enough of them, enough to let someone else carry the weight now and then. I'd like that, Garrett said, very much. They danced later. Under the cottonwoods, the whole town, watching, and for the first time in 6 long years, Josephine Larkin, now Josephine Vance, though it would take her some weeks to grow entirely used to the sound of it, did not calculate the cost of being seen. She simply let herself be seen. She found the old sketch one evening that winter, going through her sewing box for a spool of thread, and sat for a long while on the floor of her new bedroom with it spread across her knees, the same as stencil lines from that first August. Costs and shared costs and fair pay for 6 women instead of 1, a little smudged now, a little softened at the folds. She had made it the same summer Garrett first started coming around on Tuesdays, back when she still half believed the whole idea was a fantasy not worth saying out loud. It didn't feel like a fantasy anymore. It felt like a plan that had simply been waiting its turn. She brought the sketch to Garrett that same evening, spread it across the kitchen table the way she'd once spread contracts across Nathaniel Cross's desk, and watched him read it 3 times before he looked up. "This is good work," he said. "Better than good." "I know," she said, and did not apologize for knowing it. The Larkin workroom opened the following spring. In the expanded shop 2 doors down from her original counter, the lease negotiated quietly by Garrett back in the fall, the way he did most things she needed without requiring her to manage the doing of it herself. 6 founding members took their places at the long work tables that first morning. Women Josephine had watched, carefully, for months, a widow taking in laundry because it was the only income left to her. A young woman named Grace, with a genuine gift for fine needlework and no formal way to sell it. Others, who had each, in their own way, spent years doing skilled work for less than it was worth, because no one had ever offered them a fair structure to work within instead. A hand-lettered sign hung above the main table. Josephine had written the words herself, 3 drafts before she was satisfied. "This work belongs to the people who do it." The woman arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early summer, a full year almost to the day since Josephine had stood at her old table, watching Beatrice Colby's coins scatter into the mud. Josephine was at the workroom when Grace came to find her, voice low. "There's someone at the station," Grace said. "A woman. Come off the afternoon train. She's been sitting on the bench for near 20 minutes. 1 bag. Doesn't look like she knows where to go next." Josephine set down the piece she'd been reviewing. She didn't need to be told twice. She knew better than almost anyone alive exactly what that kind of stillness looked like, the rigid, careful posture of someone using every ounce of strength just to keep from coming apart in public. She found the young woman on the station bench, dark hair pinned back imperfectly beneath a travel-worn hat, hands folded tight in her lap, eyes red-rimmed but dry, holding herself together through sheer force of will. "I'm Josephine Vance," she said, sitting down beside her. "I run a workroom 2 streets over." The woman cherished. "I don't need charity. I'm not offering in any," and something in the young woman's guarded posture eased, just slightly. At that, "My name's Ivy," she said, "Ivy Hollis. I had a situation back home. I needed to leave it behind." Josephine did not ask what the situation was. She had learned in youth a long time ago exactly how much a person needed to volunteer on their own timeline, and exactly how little good it did to press for more. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" "Not yet. There's a boarding house on 4th Street. The owner's a friend of mine, fair rates, and she won't ask you a single question before she's earned the right to." Ivy studied her a long moment. "Why are you telling me all this?" Josephine thought about the answer honestly, the way she thought about most things now. Thought about a shop with a chair by the window. Thought about a man who had watched her rise out of the mud and seen in that single ordinary moment something worth paying attention to. "Because someone once did the same for me," she said, "and I'm still learning how to pass it forward properly." Ivy picked up her single bag. Stood. "Is there work?" she asked. "Not charity. There's a cooperative workroom," Josephine said. "We take on new members who can show skill and commitment. The pay is fair. Nobody owns your labor but you." She was brushing the station dust from her skirt. "Can you sew? My grandmother taught me." "Then come along," Josephine said. "I'll show you the space. You can decide for yourself if it suits you." They walked together down the main street of Cedar Bend, 2 women who had, each, in their own way, arrived in this town with almost nothing and needed everything. The dry goods store passed on their left. The hardware store on their right, Jonas Pratt visible through the window, still holding court over some slow afternoon customer. The little church at the edge of town, where Josephine had said her vows only months before, its steeple catching the late sun. Josephine walked Ivy the whole way to the workroom door, and by the time she left her there, settled at an empty work table, a length of practice fabric already in her capable hands, Grace showing her where the good needles kept the light outside had gone long and gold, the particular color the territory only wore in the last hour before supper. She rode home to the ranch that evening with the whole day, still sitting warm in her chest. Garrett was on the porch when she arrived, watching the same light settle over the pasture, and he made room for her on the step without needing to be asked. "Good day," he said. "Good day," she agreed. "I heard there's a new member at the workroom." Ivy Hollis came in on the afternoon train with nothing but a bag and a grandmother's sewing lessons. Garrett was quiet a moment, studying her face in the fading light. "You're building something," he said. "The bigger thing, not just the workroom itself." Josephine thought about that. About her father, who had built something honest with his own two hands and had it taken from him by a man who counted on nobody ever checking his work closely enough. About the corrected record hanging in their front hall. About a hand-lettered sign above a work table, and a young woman named Ivy who would walk through that door again tomorrow morning and find, waiting for her, a place where the work finally, truly belonged to the person doing it. "Yes, she suppose I am." "Good," Garrett said simply. They sat together on the porch as the light went long and honest across the land, and Josephine thought about every version of herself it had taken to arrive at this exact quiet moment. The girl who'd lost everything at 20, the woman who'd rebuilt a life out of $14 and a sewing kit, the seamstress who'd bent down into the mud in front of a watching crowd and risen back up with her spine still straight, the woman who'd stood in a courtroom and made a judge listen. Every one of those versions had been necessary, and none of them, and then she understood now, sitting here with her husband's hand, finding hers in the gathering dusk, had needed to be the last one. She had built this, all of it, every inch with the hands she had, out of the materials the world had actually given her, standing exactly as tall as she had always truly been. No one had shrunk her down to make room for it, and she intended for the whole rest of her life to make certain no one ever would again.